They called her a fool the day she dragged a broken blackboard into an abandoned barn. But what they didn't see was the fire behind her tired eyes, the kind only a woman with nothing left can carry. That barn wasn't just a ruin of hay and rotting wood. It was her battlefield. And she had a war to fight, against silence, against poverty, and against the weight of a world that forgot her long ago. Her name was Miss Clara. She had once stood in polished shoes behind a real podium, in a city school filled with laughter and books. But that was before the fire, before the accident that left her with nothing but a suitcase and a memory. The day her parents died, the world shut its doors. When she knocked, people whispered behind curtains. An orphaned woman with no husband, no children, no land. Just dreams and a government teaching license that no one in town respected. She walked into Holleridge with calloused feet and a single mission: to teach again. But the town had other ideas. Holleridge was a place where wealth spoke and struggle was silenced. There were schools, yes, but they weren't meant for the children who walked barefoot or whose lunch came in cloth sacks. They weren't meant for girls who had to babysit their siblings or boys who cleaned horse stalls to survive. Miss Clara knew that. And so she chose the barn. Because sometimes the only classroom a poor child ever sees is the one built by someone just as forgotten. The barn was falling apart, a cracked skeleton of a place once meant to hold cattle. But to Clara, it was perfect. She swept the floor, cleared the cobwebs, and carved makeshift desks from old crates. She found torn books left in donation bins, stitched their pages with twine, and arranged them with the pride of a librarian. The first morning, no one came. Just the wind and a lone rooster watching her from the rafters. But she kept writing the lessons on the board, her chalk dust floating in sunlight like defiance. On the second day, a girl peeked through the open door, then another. By the end of the week, 5 children sat on the dirt floor, their eyes wide, their feet restless. She didn't ask where they came from, only that they come back. Word spread like wildfire in the silence of small-town secrets. Parents warned their children to stay away. But the children came, one by one, hungry, hesitant, hopeful. Then came the storm. The rich families of Holleridge, those with stakes in the official school, those who wore silk and owned the grain silos, weren't pleased. They sent a warning through whispers. The barn school had to stop. But Clara didn't flinch, because she wasn't just teaching numbers and letters. She was teaching worth, planting seeds of power in soil that had been dry for decades. One morning, as Clara read aloud from a torn fable, a black car rolled up outside the barn. Its wheels crushed the wildflowers near the fence. The children froze. Clara looked up, heart pounding. The car door opened slowly, and out stepped the last boy she ever expected to see in her little barn, the son of the richest man in town, the mayor's heir. Dressed in polished leather and tailored clothes, the boy stood in the doorway, his gaze empty but curious. He didn't speak. He just walked in and sat cross-legged on the floor beside the farmhand's son. Clara blinked and kept reading. That day, something shifted. In silence, a storm was coming, not the kind that thundered through the sky, but one that would uproot the town's pride, crack open its secrets, and change the meaning of wealth forever. Because now, the rich man's son was learning under the orphaned teacher's roof. The silence that followed the mayor's son stepping into Clara's barn was heavier than thunder. It didn't take long for whispers to turn into warnings, and warnings into rage. By sundown, the whole town knew. The boy with a future written in gold had chosen to sit on the dirt floor beside children who had nothing but dreams. And the man who controlled Holleridge, Mayor Alcott, was not a man who tolerated disobedience. Mayor Alcott was the kind of man whose voice alone made business owners tremble, and whose name sent school inspectors scrambling. His power didn't come from kindness or service. It came from land ownership, money, and fear. And his son, Andrew, was supposed to inherit all of it. The farms, the estate, the respect. Not sit in a barn with paupers learning from a woman who didn't even own a home. That night, Clara stayed in the barn long after the children left. She sat by the oil lamp, grading scribbled writing on old paper scraps and listening to the crickets. But her peace was shattered by headlights. A black SUV rumbled up the dirt path. Clara stood as the mayor stepped out, his face twisted in disgust. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His voice was cold, deliberate, and heavy with entitlement. He called her a fraud. He called the children a distraction. He accused her of corrupting his son and embarrassing his name. He demanded she shut the barn school down or face official consequences. But Clara didn't speak. She only looked him in the eye and turned away. That was her answer. The next day, Clara arrived at the barn to find the doors chained shut. A red paper was nailed to the wood. Unsafe structure. Cease operations. Her hands trembled as she tore it down. The barn had been standing longer than most of the mayor's policies. It wasn't about safety. It was about control. But Clara wasn't done. That afternoon, she gathered her students beneath the old oak tree nearby. They sat in the shade with notebooks on their laps, their backs pressed against the roots like nature's desk chairs. She brought the chalkboard and leaned it against the trunk, and class resumed. Birds chirped above. The wind danced with their laughter. Soon, more children came. Not just the poor ones. Some came from houses with clean walls and full fridges. They came not because they had to, but because something about Miss Clara's classroom felt more honest than any place they'd ever known. Even Andrew returned, wearing old jeans instead of his school uniform. He helped the younger ones with their letters, and when asked why, he simply said, "Because she listens." The mayor, blinded by pride, took his battle to City Hall. He demanded the police intervene. He called for the education board to revoke Clara's license. But the papers she'd brought to town were all legal. Clara had dotted every I and crossed every T. She knew how they'd come for her, and she prepared long before she taught her first alphabet under that roof. With every new child who joined the classes under the tree, Clara's strength grew. So did the town's curiosity. Some parents who once whispered insults began standing at a distance, watching as their children recited poems with joy. Some wiped tears as they realized this orphaned teacher had done more for their kids than any polished institution ever had. But the battle wasn't over. Late one evening, as Clara packed up the torn books and walked the last child home, a figure watched her from the shadows. The mayor wasn't just angry now, he was desperate. And when men like him get desperate, they stop playing by the rules. Because power isn't just about money. Sometimes, it's about breaking the one person brave enough to stand against it. And Clara was about to find out just how far he would go. The morning after the warning, Holleridge woke to smoke. Black plumes curled into the sky like angry fingers. The barn, the heart of Clara's humble school, was ablaze. By the time she got there, the roof had collapsed. Flames danced across the beams, devouring everything she had built. Her books, her chalkboard, her lessons, all turned to ash. Neighbors stood and watched in silence, some with pity, others with smirks. No one moved to help. Clara didn't cry. She knelt in the dirt, black soot clinging to her hands, and stared at the place where so many children had found their voice. Around her, ashes settled like snow on her shoulders. The fire chief ruled it an accident. Said maybe a lantern tipped or a lightning bolt struck in the night, but Clara knew better. Everyone did. There'd been no storm, no lantern, just a mayor who didn't like losing control. The children came that afternoon, wide-eyed and speechless. Some carried water buckets, others brought pages that had survived. Clara sat them under the same oak tree. She had nothing left to give, but still, she gave her presence. She wrote lessons in the dirt with a stick, and the children listened, sitting cross-legged, their eyes burning with defiance. That night, as Clara walked home, her shoes torn and her spirit heavy, a horse-drawn carriage rolled into town, a rare sight in Hollow Ridge. It stopped in front of the general store. A tall man stepped down. He wore a wide-brimmed black hat and a long coat that trailed the dust. His face was hidden by shadow, but his presence made even the most arrogant men straighten their backs. No one knew his name. But whispers started. They said he came from the West, that he was a wealthy rancher, that he'd once rebuilt a whole town with his bare hands. Some said he was just passing through. Others swore he came for a reason. The next morning, Clara was surprised to find that same man sitting under the oak tree with her students. He didn't speak, just listened as the children read their stories aloud. When Clara approached, he stood, removed his hat, and nodded with quiet respect. Then he left a small, folded paper on the ground beside her, a note scribbled in rough handwriting. "Build it again, but stronger. Use this." Inside was a check. It was more money than Clara had ever seen. That afternoon, the townspeople gathered around the tree, not out of curiosity, but shame. The blacksmith offered lumber. A widow offered space on her land. A carpenter pledged tools. Even the children's parents, once ashamed of the barn teacher, stood by her side. Because when the fire tried to break her, Clara didn't vanish. She grew. Within days, a new school began to rise. This time not from ruin, but from unity. And at the center of it was a woman who had no blood family, no inheritance, and no title. Only courage. Mayor Alcott watched from behind his mansion windows. He thought the fire would silence her. Instead, it baptized her. Clara had become more than a teacher now. She was a symbol, and symbols are much harder to burn. But the mayor wasn't done. Not yet. Because soon he would find out that his own son had made a decision, one that would turn their quiet town into a storm. The new school rose fast. Timber laid by worn hands, walls painted with hope, and every nail hammered by those who once turned away. It wasn't polished, it wasn't pretty, but it stood firm. No chandeliers, no tiled floors, just sunlight pouring through open windows and laughter that bounced off the barnwood walls like music. Clara didn't call it a school. She called it a promise. Andrew came every day, no longer sneaking, no longer hiding. He helped stack books, swept the floors, and led the younger ones through their spelling. His father's name couldn't reach him anymore. Something in the boy had shifted. Not rebellion, but revelation. In Clara's school, he saw dignity, not charity, and for the first time in his life, he felt useful, not as a future mayor, but as a person. But the town wasn't ready for what happened next. It began during the Founders' Day ceremony when every student in Hollow Ridge stood on the main stage to perform. Mayor Alcott had planned to parade his son at the town hall steps, dressed in a fresh suit, reading a pre-written speech about tradition and excellence. But Andrew had different plans. When his name was called, he walked onto the stage holding a different piece of paper, tattered, handwritten. He looked into the crowd, then into his father's eyes, and read, "I learned more from a woman with no building than I ever did behind stone walls. She taught us how to stand when we are small, how to speak when we are silenced. Her name is Miss Clara, and she's my teacher." The silence that followed was earth-shattering. The mayor's face turned to stone. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some clapped. Others didn't know what to do. But Clara, standing at the back in her faded dress and dusty shoes, just lowered her head, humbled by a truth she never asked to be spoken aloud. But the mayor was not a man to lose gracefully. Within days, a formal letter arrived for Clara, signed by a state official. It stated that a complaint had been filed, that Clara had lied about her qualifications, that her orphan status made her unfit to teach, and that legal action could follow. But Clara had kept secrets too, and one of them was buried deep in her past. Long before the fire, long before Hollow Ridge, Clara had once been a rising academic, a researcher at a prestigious university with honors pinned to her name. But after losing her family and suffering a breakdown, she walked away from it all. She never wanted power, she wanted purpose. And the system didn't care for women who broke apart, then stood up again without permission. Until now, she'd hidden that past out of fear they'd say she was unstable, too soft, or too scarred. But now, as the town turned its eyes to her, waiting for her to break again, Clara chose to stand. She stepped into the town meeting hall that week, holding a box of old papers, certificates, letters from former students across the country. Her voice did not tremble. She placed everything on the mayor's desk, stared him in the eyes, and walked out. The next morning, the mayor's office was empty. His resignation had been filed quietly. No speech, no press, just silence. And yet, something deeper was brewing beneath all this, because one final secret still lay in wait. One that had nothing to do with education. One that involved Clara's true connection to Andrew, and a decision she made long ago that was finally coming back. Clara thought the fire had been the end. Then she thought the chains on the barn were... Then the mayor's letter. But none of it broke her. And when the town began to whisper her name with respect instead of ridicule, she realized something. Survival wasn't her victory. Her real victory was the children sitting in class each day with lifted heads and proud voices. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done yet. It began when Andrew came to her one afternoon, holding an old envelope with yellowed edges. His voice was quiet, his hands unsure. He said he'd found it in the attic of his father's mansion, tucked behind dusty books, sealed and marked in cursive. The letter had her name on it, Clara Bell. She took it, trembling. She hadn't heard that full name in years. As she opened it, a wave of time washed over her. Inside was a truth she thought had been buried forever. The letter was from her older sister, a sister she hadn't seen since she was 17, the sister who had given birth to a boy she couldn't raise, and who had left him in Clara's care before vanishing. Clara had kept him for a year, loved him like a mother, but after losing her job and struggling to feed them both, she had made the hardest decision of her life. She gave the boy up to a family who could give him more. She never knew who adopted him. Until now. Andrew had been hers, not by birth, but by bond, by love, by sacrifice. The mayor hadn't adopted Andrew out of kindness. He'd done it for image, for political appearances. Clara had unknowingly taught the boy she once rocked to sleep, the boy she gave up so he wouldn't grow up hungry. And through fate's strange weaving, he had come back to her, not through bloodlines, but through a chalkboard, a barn, and a lesson on worth. When Andrew learned the truth, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he smiled. A quiet, soft smile, and simply sat beside her, as he always had, and opened his book. Clara didn't cry. She just reached out, placed her hand on his, and continued the lesson. That week, the town voted to name the new school Bell Academy. Not after wealth, not after bloodlines, but after the woman who rebuilt it with her bare hands and her unbreakable soul. The children planted a tree beside the school and carved her name into a stone at its roots. Clara never sought recognition. She never needed applause. But when she walked through town now, hats were tipped, doors were held open, and children ran to hug her skirt. Not because she had taught them math or grammar, but because she had taught them what dignity looks like when the world takes everything. Years later, when Clara's hair turned silver and her back grew tired, she would still sit under the old oak tree on warm mornings, reading to little ones who didn't know her story. But she never corrected them when they called her Mama Clara, because some names are earned, not given. And in the barn where hope once burned down, a legacy stood tall, built not of stone, but of heart.